Hi everyone, hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. Let's start with the actual history, because this isn't a facility that got built last year. Iran's investment in underground military infrastructure goes back decades, and the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency has stated plainly that Iran operates the largest underground facility program anywhere in the Middle East. A journalistic investigation using satellite image analysis identified a total of 27 underground bases and 107 tunnels making up Iran's broader military underground network, spread across the country's mountainous regions, specifically because that terrain gives natural concealment and structural protection that flat desert simply can't. Among all of those sites, the complex built into the mountains south of Isfahan, often referred to by the name of the specific mountain, Sofe, stands out because it isn't just a storage bunker. It's described by analysts as sitting at the center of Iran's largest missile assembly and production ecosystem, the industrial heart of the country's ballistic missile program, rather than just one more place to hide finished weapons. That last detail matters a lot, so let's sit with it for a second. According to open-source defense analysis, Iran's indigenous ballistic missile development around Isfahan reportedly evolved with technical cooperation from China and North Korea, dating back to the late Cold War era. This isn't a facility Iran threw together in response to the current conflict. It's the product of a multi-decade national investment built with outside technical help, specifically designed around the assumption that no adversary would ever be able to definitively find or permanently silence it. That's the hidden for 40 years part of the story, and it's genuinely accurate. This kind of deep, deliberate concealment has been Iranian strategic doctrine since long before this current war even began. Now, let's get to what actually happened when this war reached that mountain. Once the current conflict opened in late February, American and Allied strikes turned their attention specifically to underground missile facilities across Iran, and the Isfahan area sites were high on that list. Satellite imagery reviewed by CNN in the early weeks of the war showed facilities like the Isfahan North missile base absolutely ravaged by multiple strikes. Tunnel entrances buried under mountains of debris, launch vehicles destroyed in the open, access roads deliberately cratered to prevent mobile missile launchers from driving in or out. That's not speculation or an exaggerated headline. That's independently reviewed satellite evidence from one of the most credible outlets covering this conflict. And the broader effort didn't stop at just the entrances. The U.S. and Israel also went after Iran's missile supply chain more broadly, including factories producing the small electronic components that feed into these weapon systems, aiming to degrade Iran's ability to rebuild and resupply, not just to seal off what was already stockpiled underground. Let's talk about the actual weapon that made a strike like this possible, because this is where the technical story gets genuinely fascinating. Facilities built this deep, under this much rock, require something purpose-built to reach them, which is exactly why we've spent time on this channel walking through weapons like the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator and the smaller GBU-72. Open-source defense reporting and analysis specifically covering the Isfahan mountain complex has pointed to the GBU-72 as a likely weapon used in strikes against these underground missile sites, delivered by aircraft capable of carrying it, working in coordination with the same kind of layered strike packages we've discussed before. Electronic warfare aircraft clearing the way, precision strike aircraft delivering the actual penetrating munitions. I want to flag something important here, though. The specific attribution of the GBU-72 to this particular site comes from open-source defense analysis and reporting, rather than an explicit CENTCOM statement naming that weapon for that specific target. So treat that detail as credible, but not officially confirmed, down to the exact munition. Here's where I need to slow down and give you the part of this story that a lot of other channels are skipping, because it's the part that actually makes this a serious, honest analysis instead of just a highlight reel. The strikes in the opening weeks of the war were real, and they did real damage. That much is well documented. But CNN's own reporting, reviewing more recent satellite imagery from the following months, found something that complicates the simple victory narrative significantly. At a related underground missile base north of Kermanshah, satellite images showed that a pair of tunnel entrances that had been bombed by the U.S. and Israel had since been reopened. The roads leading to those tunnels, the same roads that had been deliberately cratered to prevent missile launchers from moving in or out, had been repaired and repaved. CNN's own framing of this discovery was direct. Iran's reopened underground missile sites show the limits of the U.S. bombing plan. That's not a claim. From Iranian state media. That's independent satellite analysis reported by one of the most credible outlets covering this entire conflict. And it tells you that whatever happened in the opening weeks, it wasn't a permanent one-time solution to the underground missile problem. There's a specific, harder to verify account about the Sofe mountain complex itself that circulated in open source defense reporting, describing local residents saying missiles kept emerging from the bombed mountain even after what was reported as roughly 20 separate strikes, with the facility reportedly resuming activity within as little as 12 hours after being hit. I want to be very careful with that specific claim, because the outlet reporting it noted plainly that independent verification of those precise numbers, 20 strikes, 12-hour downtime, remained limited. What that same reporting did say with more confidence is that the broader pattern those numbers were meant to illustrate, repeated strikes followed by renewed activity, was consistent with what could actually be observed in available satellite imagery of the Isfahan campaign more broadly. So treat the specific numbers with real skepticism, but understand that the underlying pattern they're describing, a facility that kept getting hit and kept coming back, lines up with CNN's independently reported findings about the Kermanshah site being reopened months later. Let's talk about why a facility built specifically to be indestructible can still be repaired and reused. Because understanding this actually explains a lot about how underground warfare works at a level most coverage doesn't get into. Open source intelligence assessments have concluded that although these strikes inflicted severe infrastructural damage on Iran's underground missile architecture, the network as a whole retained enough redundancy, engineering depth, and repair capacity to sustain some level of operational continuity, even through prolonged bombardment. Think about what that actually means practically. A single tunnel entrance, however well defended, is ultimately just an entrance. Rubble and cratered roads can be cleared and repaved by construction crews working weeks or months after a strike, especially if the deeper storage and assembly infrastructure behind that entrance wasn't itself destroyed. Bunker buster weapons are extraordinarily effective at defeating the specific structure they hit directly, but a facility with multiple redundant tunnel systems spread across a wide mountain complex doesn't necessarily go permanently offline just because one or even several entrances get sealed. That's genuinely different from a single, isolated bunker like Fordow, where the target was one specific, deeply buried facility rather than a sprawling network with built-in redundancy by design. There's also a real vulnerability on Iran's side of this equation that's worth understanding, because it cuts back the other direction. Defense analysis, examining footage Iran itself released of these underground missile tunnels, footage the regime put out specifically to Project Strength and Deterrence, identified what one detailed technical review called a major vulnerability hiding inside the propaganda. The munitions inside many of these tunnels are stored out in the open along long, continuous corridors and large caverns, with limited or no blast doors and no separated revetments between different sections. That kind of storage design, while efficient for moving mobile launchers in and out quickly, creates a real risk of a chain reaction if the facility is ever successfully breached deep enough, one detonation potentially setting off a cascade of secondary explosions along the entire tunnel system, rather than damage staying contained to a single isolated chamber the way a more compartmentalized design would allow. So, even a facility engineered around redundancy and resilience at the entrance level can carry serious internal vulnerabilities once you're actually inside it. And Iran's own promotional footage inadvertently gave outside analysts a clearer picture of exactly that risk. Let's be precise about timelines here too, because there's a real risk of conflating two separate conflicts when talking about strikes on Iranian underground facilities, and I want to keep this channel's reporting accurate on that front specifically. The Kermanshah underground missile facility, which housed Qam-1 and Fateh-110 ballistic missiles, was struck and largely destroyed by Israeli airstrikes back in June 2025, during what's referred to as the 12-Day War, a distinct, earlier Israel-Iran conflict that predates the current, broader U.S.-Iran war that began in late February 2026. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed at the time that multiple missile storage buildings and tunnel entrances at that specific facility were damaged or destroyed across a total of 10 separate strike locations. That's a real confirmed event, but it's a different war than the one we've been covering on this channel for months now. The CNN reporting about reopened tunnels near Kermanshah that we discussed earlier is describing satellite imagery reviewed in the current conflict's timeline, which suggests Iran may have used the gap between the 2025 conflict and the current one, or periods of relative calm within the current war itself, to repair infrastructure that had been damaged previously. Keeping these timelines straight matters, because it's very easy for a script chasing a dramatic headline to blur a 2025 Israeli strike together with a 2026 American one as if they were the same continuous event, and that's exactly the kind of imprecision that erodes trust with an audience that's actually paying attention. So, what's the honest, complete picture of the Isfahan area underground missile campaign as of today? Real, documented, independently verified damage was inflicted in the opening weeks of this war. Tunnel entrances buried, roads cratered, vehicles destroyed. That's not in dispute. But the deeper claim implied by a title like "One Bomb Found It, and That Was That" oversells what actually happened. CNN's own later reporting shows Iran repairing and reopening at least some of these facilities within months, and broader open source assessment suggests the underground network as a whole retained meaningful redundancy and repair capacity throughout sustained bombardment. The honest conclusion sits somewhere in the middle of the two extremes you'll see across different channels covering this story, not Iran's. Underground missile program was destroyed in one dramatic strike, and not the bombing campaign accomplished nothing. It's a story about real, significant, but ultimately partial and temporary degradation of a deeply redundant system that was specifically engineered, over decades, to survive exactly this kind of sustained pressure. Let's talk about what this specific case teaches us about the broader strategic picture, because I think it connects directly to something we've discussed before on this channel regarding deeply buried targets generally. The Pentagon's own concerns, according to open source defense analysis, extend well beyond just Iran here. The repeated operational recovery of complexes like Safi Mountain has reportedly intensified planning concerns that any future conflict against deeply buried missile networks, whether in Iran, North Korea, or China, could require sustained bombardment campaigns measured in months, rather than the days or weeks that a single dramatic strike might suggest. That's a genuinely important strategic lesson with implications reaching well past this one war. And it's part of why understanding the nuanced, partial nature of these Isfahan strikes matters more than just celebrating a single explosive headline. Let's move into the global roundup section, because there's relevant context worth including here too. The broader diplomatic situation around this war remains fragile, with the large-scale strike operation that was canceled back on August 1st still hanging over an uncertain negotiation process, as we've covered on this channel recently. Separately, Iran's broader underground missile doctrine has continued showing up in state media even during this war, with the regime periodically releasing footage of other tunnel facilities specifically intended to project resilience and deterrence to both domestic and international audiences. Footage that, as we just discussed, has occasionally given outside analysts more insight into real vulnerabilities than the regime probably intended. And on the technical side of the broader bunker defeat conversation, we've covered on this channel how America's own nuclear-capable penetrator program, the B-6113, is explicitly justified in part by exactly the same category of problem: hardened and deeply buried targets that conventional strikes alone may not permanently resolve, whether the target in question sits in Iran, Russia, or China. Now let's get into the strategic analysis, because I think the real lesson of the Isfahan missile city story is bigger than just this one facility. For decades, Iran's entire underground doctrine rested on an assumption similar to what we discussed regarding Fordo, that sufficient depth and reinforced construction could functionally neutralize a technologically superior adversary's ability to strike. What the Isfahan campaign actually demonstrates is a more nuanced version of that story than either side's propaganda wants to admit. American bunker defeat weapons clearly can reach and seriously damage even Iran's most hardened, most redundant underground missile infrastructure. That much is proven by independently verified satellite imagery. But a sprawling, deliberately redundant network built over 40 years with built-in repair capacity doesn't stay permanently silenced after a single strike campaign, however. Intense. That's a different and more sobering lesson than American bombs are unstoppable or Iranian bunkers are impenetrable. The real answer is that this kind of underground infrastructure war is a sustained attritional contest measured in months and years, not a single dramatic night that resolves the underlying problem once and for all. That has real implications for how you should think about every future headline you see on this exact topic, including ones about this same Isfahan complex. If you see a video claiming a single strike permanently destroyed Iran's underground missile, where does this story go from here? I'd watch whether continued satellite monitoring shows further repair and reopening activity at sites like Safi Mountain and the broader Isfahan complex, which would tell us whether Iran's repair capacity is holding up under sustained pressure or gradually being worn down over the length of this war. I'd watch whether any renewed American strike campaign, including the larger operation that was paused earlier this month, specifically targets this network again, given how central it appears to be to Iran's broader missile production ecosystem rather than just missile storage. And I'd watch whether this specific case study starts showing up more explicitly in American defense planning discussions about North Korea and China, given that Pentagon concerns about prolonged bombardment campaigns against deeply buried networks clearly extend well beyond just this one conflict.